The music box had been playing the same lullaby for 3 hours straight when Isabella Ashford finally worked up the courage to approach it with an axe. But by then, it was already too late to save her daughter Clara from whatever had been calling to her through that haunting melody since the autumn auction at Ravenshollow Estate. The trouble had started innocently enough on a crisp October morning in Thornfield Crossing, where the mist clung to the Connecticut hills like fingers reluctant to release their hold on the living world. Isabella had attended the estate sale seeking practical items for her growing household, perhaps linens or kitchen implements that could serve her family through the approaching winter months. She had not intended to bid on curiosities or decorative pieces that served no earthly purpose beyond ornamentation. But when auctioneer Marcus Crowley lifted the small wooden music box from among the collection of items scattered across the makeshift table in Ravenshollow's abandoned parlor, something about the instrument drew Isabella's attention like a moth to candlelight. The rectangular case appeared unremarkable at first glance, no larger than a woman's jewelry box, inlaid with mother-of-pearl forget-me-nots that caught the weak autumn sunlight filtering through dust-caked windows. Crowley wound the brass key to demonstrate the piece's working condition, and the melody that emerged stopped every conversation in the room. The tune was both achingly familiar and impossible to place, a children's lullaby that seemed to echo from the deepest chambers of memory, carrying with it the phantom sensation of being very small and very afraid, in a dark room where shadows moved without wind to stir them. Have you ever heard a melody that filled you with inexplicable dread, as if it carried secrets you were never meant to know? Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and share any experiences you've had with music boxes or childhood songs that seem to come from somewhere beyond the living world. "Exquisite craftsmanship," Crowley announced to the assembled bidders, his voice echoing strangely in the high-ceilinged room. This particular piece belonged to the Grimwald Children's Nursery. Handcrafted in Bavaria, imported at considerable expense for the late family's youngest members. Everyone in Thornfield Crossing knew the tragedy of the Grimwald children, though it was not a story often spoken aloud in polite company. 5 young souls, ranging in age from 3 to 12, had succumbed to diphtheria during the bitter winter of 1846. They had died within a span of 8 days, one after another, while their parents, Cornelius and Evangeline Grimwald, watched helplessly as the physician exhausted every remedy in his considerable arsenal. The loss had destroyed the family completely. Evangeline Grimwald had been found at the bottom of Thornfield Creek the following spring, her pockets filled with stones and her face bearing an expression of peaceful release that suggested death had been welcomed rather than feared. Cornelius had lingered on alone in the vast estate for another decade, growing increasingly reclusive and strange, until his own death the previous summer left Ravenshollow empty and silent. Now the possessions of the once prominent family were being dispersed to pay debts and taxes, scattering the remnants of their tragedy to whoever possessed sufficient coins and curiosity to bid. Isabella found herself raising her hand when Crowley called for opening offers on the music box, though she could not have explained the compulsion that drove her to participate in the auction. The melody had awakened something within her that felt disturbingly like homesickness, a longing for something she had never possessed but somehow remembered losing. Other hands rose as well, and the bidding climbed higher than such a simple item warranted, as if each person present felt the same inexplicable attraction to the small wooden box and its otherworldly song. When the auctioneer's hammer fell, and the music box was declared hers for the sum of $4.50, more than she had spent on her family's winter coal supply, Isabella experienced a mixture of triumph and unease that she would later recognize as the first indication that her life had taken a turn towards something far darker than she could have imagined. The music box sat wrapped in brown paper on her kitchen table for 5 days before Isabella found the courage to wind its mechanism again. During those days, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were waiting for something momentous to occur. Her youngest daughter, Clara, was the first to sense the change in their home's atmosphere. The child had always possessed an unusual sensitivity to moods and undercurrents that escaped adult attention, the kind of intuitive awareness that made her the first to know when storms were approaching or when visitors were coming up the lane before their footsteps could be heard. Clara began experiencing difficulty sleeping, claiming that someone was singing lullabies in her room after the lamps were extinguished. "It's the prettiest song, Mama," Clara told Isabella while they prepared breakfast on the 6th morning after the auction. "But it makes my chest feel tight and strange, like when we visited Grandmama's grave last summer and you cried." Isabella's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the wooden mixing bowl. "What kind of song, sweetheart?" Clara tilted her head slightly, as if listening to sounds that only she could perceive, then began to hum a melody that made Isabella's blood turn to ice water in her veins. It was the tune from the music box, rendered in her daughter's clear, innocent voice, but somehow transformed, slower, more melancholy, carrying harmonies that no 5-year-old should have been able to imagine or reproduce. "Where did you learn that particular song?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded receiving an answer. "The children taught it to me," Clara replied with the matter-of-fact tone that children use for statements that would terrify adults. "They visit my window every night after Papa goes to sleep. They want me to come outside and play with them, but I remember you said never to open windows after dark, especially when the moon isn't shining." Isabella set aside her bread dough and knelt beside her daughter, taking the child's small hands in her own trembling grasp. Clara's fingers felt unnaturally cold despite the warmth radiating from the kitchen fire, and her eyes held a distant quality that suggested she was seeing things that existed beyond the normal world of tables and chairs, and morning sunlight streaming through clean windows. "How many children come to visit you?" Isabella asked gently, though part of her mind recoiled from the question and its potential implications. Clara closed her eyes as if consulting some internal vision, then opened them with an expression of solemn certainty. "5 of them. The oldest is a girl with golden hair like mine, but longer, and she wears a white dress with tiny pearl buttons. The youngest is a little boy who doesn't talk much because his throat hurts from being sick. They all look sad and lonely, and they want me to come outside so we can play games that never end." The description struck Isabella like a physical blow. 5 children, exactly the number the Grimwald family had lost to diphtheria 12 years earlier. She had attended their joint funeral service, had seen their small white coffins arranged in the front of St. Bartholomew's Church, while their parents sat like broken dolls in the front pew, and Clara's description matched the appearance of the deceased children with an accuracy that could not be explained by coincidence or imagination. That evening, Isabella positioned herself in a chair beside Clara's bedroom window, determined to discover the truth behind her daughter's claims about nocturnal visitors. She had convinced herself that the child was experiencing particularly vivid dreams, perhaps triggered by the unsettling atmosphere that had pervaded their home since the music box's arrival. But as the hours passed and midnight approached, Isabella began to hear the singing herself. It started as a whisper barely distinguishable from wind moving through the bare branches of the elm tree outside Clara's window. But gradually the sound grew clearer and more defined, resolving into the voices of children singing in perfect harmony. The melody was indeed the haunting tune from the music box, but rendered by young voices that carried an otherworldly quality. Too pure, too perfect, resonating with frequencies that seemed to originate from places far removed from earthly throats and lungs. Isabella pressed her face against the cold window glass and peered into the darkness beyond. Initially she saw nothing but shadows and the skeletal silhouettes of winter-bare trees, but as her eyes adjusted to the moonless night, she began to distinguish shapes that should not have been present. Small figures standing in a semicircle beneath Clara's window, their faces turned upward toward the glass with expressions of patient, desperate longing. The children appeared exactly as Clara had described them. The oldest girl stood at the center of the group, her long golden hair flowing around shoulders clothed in a white dress that seemed to generate its own faint luminescence. The youngest was indeed a boy who appeared to be no more than 4 years old, his small hand pressed to his throat in a gesture that spoke of lingering pain from the illness that had claimed his life. But the most disturbing aspect of the apparitions was not their presence, but their condition. Each child bore the unmistakable signs of the disease that had killed them 12 years earlier: the pallor of fever, the hollow look around their eyes that spoke of suffering beyond their tender years, the way they swayed slightly as if weakened by sickness that still coursed through their spectral forms like poison through water. As Isabella watched in fascination and growing horror, the children's singing grew louder and more insistent. Their luminous eyes never left Clara's window, and their gestures became more animated, as if they were attempting to communicate something urgent through their supernatural performance. The oldest girl, who could only be Adelaide Grimwald, extended one translucent hand toward the glass with desperate yearning, while little Oliver began to weep tears that caught the starlight and fell like liquid silver onto the frost-covered ground. The song they sang was no longer the simple melody that had emerged from the music box at Ravenshollow Estate. It had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing, a harmony of voices that spoke of loss and isolation, and the terrible loneliness of being separated from the warmth and comfort of living families. Isabella could not distinguish individual words, if indeed there were words, but the emotional content of their singing was unmistakable. They were calling to Clara, pleading with her to join them in whatever existence they inhabited between life and death. Isabella's maternal instincts overcame her terror, and she moved to place herself more firmly between the ghostly children and her sleeping daughter. As she did so, the singing stopped abruptly, and 5 pairs of luminous eyes turned their attention from the window to her own face. In that moment of direct contact, Isabella felt something cold and searching touch the edges of her consciousness, not malicious, but desperate and hungry in a way that made her understand why mothers throughout history had warned their children about things that called to them from darkness. The spectral children remained visible for several minutes longer, their forms growing gradually more transparent as Isabella stared back at them with protective determination. Finally, Adelaide lowered her reaching hand and turned away from the window, leading the other 4 in a slow procession across the yard toward the wood line, where shadows swallowed them as completely as if they had never existed. Isabella spent the remainder of the night sitting beside Clara's bed, listening for any indication that the ghostly visitors might return. But the house remained quiet, except for the normal sounds of settling timber and winter wind, and Clara slept peacefully for the first time since the music box had entered their home. Morning brought no relief from the previous night's revelations. Only the harsh clarity of daylight applied to impossible memories. Isabella found herself questioning her own sanity while she prepared breakfast, wondering if grief over her mother's death the previous winter had somehow affected her perceptions and caused her to see manifestations of her own unconscious fears and longings. But Clara's behavior eliminated any possibility that the experience had been purely subjective hallucination. The child woke with detailed knowledge of the 5 ghostly visitors that she could not have acquired through dreams or imagination alone. She knew their names: Adelaide, Frederick, Rosalind, Oliver, and little Beatrice, and she could describe the toys they had played with in life, the games they had enjoyed, and the terrible story of how they had died one by one while their parents watched helplessly. "They're so very sad, Mama," Clara told Isabella while they ate their morning porridge. "They miss their mother and father terribly, and they don't understand why they can't go home to Ravenshollow anymore. They've been waiting such a long time for someone to play with them, and they believe I might be the friend they've been searching for all these lonely years." Isabella set down her spoon with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. "Clara, dearest, you must not listen to those children. They're not the kind of friends that little girls should seek." "But why not?" Clara asked with genuine confusion. "They seem kind and gentle, and they're so terribly lonely. Adelaide says they know wonderful games to play in the place where they live now. She says it's always springtime there and no one ever becomes sick or sad or frightened." The innocent trust in her daughter's voice filled Isabella with a dread that transcended rational fear. The ghostly children were not content merely to sing outside windows. They were actively recruiting Clara to join them in whatever realm they inhabited beyond the boundary of life and death. And from Clara's description, their otherworldly existence sounded exactly like the kind of paradise that would appeal to a 5-year-old's developing imagination. Isabella made a decision that would torment her conscience for years to come. She retrieved the music box from its place on the kitchen shelf and carried it toward the fireplace, intending to burn the instrument and hopefully sever whatever connection it maintained with the deceased Grimwald children. The wooden case felt unnaturally cold against her palms, and the mother-of-pearl forget-me-nots seemed to shift and writhe beneath her touch as if they possessed independent life. But as she lifted the music box to cast it into the flames, the lid sprang open without anyone touching the mechanism, and the familiar melody began to play without the key being wound. The haunting tune filled the kitchen with its otherworldly beauty, and Isabella felt her resolution weakening as memories she had never lived began to surface in her consciousness like bubbles rising from the bottom of a deep, dark well. She found herself remembering childhood games played with companions who laughed and sang and never grew tired or cross or sad. She recalled tea parties where the cookies never crumbled and the milk never soured, and hide-and-seek in gardens where flowers bloomed eternally and winter never came to kill the roses. She felt the warmth of friendships that would endure forever, and the security of being loved by playmates who would never abandon her or grow up and move away. The music box was extending an invitation, she realized with dawning comprehension. She could destroy it and protect Clara from the ghostly children's influence, or she could allow the connection to continue and perhaps join her daughter in the perfect world that the melody promised to those brave enough to cross the threshold between life and whatever lay beyond. "Mama," Clara said urgently, her small voice cutting through the spell that the music box had begun to weave around Isabella's consciousness. "They're coming back, and this time they're not staying outside." Isabella turned toward the kitchen window and gasped at what she saw. The 5 spectral children were approaching across the yard in broad daylight, their forms clearly visible against the autumn landscape, despite the morning sun shining directly upon them. They moved with far more purpose than they had displayed during their nocturnal visit, and their expressions had changed from pleading to determination, tinged with something that might have been desperation. Adelaide led the group with her translucent hand extended toward the house, while the others followed in a formation that suggested they had planned this approach with careful deliberation. As the ghostly children drew nearer to the kitchen window, the music box in Isabella's hands grew colder and heavier, its melody becoming more complex and urgent with each step they took. Isabella could feel Clara moving to stand beside her, drawn by the same irresistible compulsion that the music and the spirits seemed to exert on anyone who encountered them. The child's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and her eyes reflected the same dreamy longing that Isabella recognized in her own expression whenever the haunting melody played. "Don't let them inside, Mama," Clara whispered, though her voice carried yearning as well as fear. "They want me to come with them to their special place, and part of me wants to go so very badly, but something deep inside tells me that if I do, I'll never see you or Papa again." Isabella summoned every ounce of maternal strength and protective instinct she possessed, and hurled the music box into the blazing fireplace with all the force that desperation and love could provide. The wooden case struck the burning logs with a crash that sent sparks flying up the chimney, and for a moment the kitchen filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood and heated metal. The melody stopped abruptly, as if severed by an invisible blade, and the silence that followed felt profound and final as the silence that follows death. Through the window, Isabella saw the 5 ghostly children halt their advance and turn their luminous faces toward the house with expressions of betrayal and profound loss that would haunt her dreams for the remainder of her natural life. They remained visible for several heartbeats longer, their forms growing fainter and more transparent with each passing second, until they faded completely from view, like morning mist dissipating in the warmth of full sunlight. but their expressions of abandonment and desperate sorrow lingered in Isabella's memory long after their spectral forms had vanished from the physical world. Isabella's relief at apparently ending the supernatural threat proved tragically premature. When she retrieved the music box from the fireplace ashes with iron tongs, expecting to find charred and twisted remains, she discovered that the instrument looked exactly as it had before she cast it into the flames. The wooden case bore no marks from heat or smoke, the mother-of-pearl forget-me-nots gleamed with pristine beauty, and the brass mechanism showed no signs of having been subjected to destructive fire. More disturbing still, the music box now played its haunting melody continuously without being wound, its mechanism apparently powered by some force that had nothing to do with springs or clockwork. The otherworldly tune filled their home day and night, growing louder whenever Clara approached and softer when she moved away, as if it were specifically calibrated to maintain its supernatural hold on the child's developing consciousness. The ghostly Grimwald children did not return to the yard outside Clara's window, but their presence could be felt throughout the house like a constant, watching presence. Temperatures dropped inexplicably in rooms where the music box's melody was loudest, and shadows moved independently of their sources when no one was looking directly at them. Clara began sleepwalking with disturbing frequency, always toward whatever room contained the cursed instrument, and Isabella would wake to find her daughter standing motionless beside the music box, with her hands pressed against its glass top while tears streamed silently down her pale cheeks. "They're still calling to me, Mama?" Clara would say when her mother roused her from these supernatural trances. "They say they need me to complete their circle of friendship, and then they can all find their way home together to the place where their parents are waiting. They say their Mama and Papa have been so lonely since they went away." Isabella tried relocating the music box to different areas throughout the house, hoping to break whatever mystical connection it maintained with her daughter. She placed it in the root cellar, where its melody echoed eerily off the stone walls. But Clara still found her way to it during the darkest hours of night. She secured it in the attic, but the otherworldly music seemed to seep through the floorboards and fill the entire house with its haunting presence. Desperate for guidance and assistance, Isabella sought counsel from Reverend Silas Hartwell, whose small congregation included most of the families scattered throughout Thornfield Crossing. Hartwell was a practical man who dealt primarily with matters of crops and weather, and the everyday spiritual challenges of rural life. But he listened to Isabella's account with growing concern, and offered what ecclesiastical wisdom he possessed. "There are forces in this world that exist beyond our mortal understanding," Reverend Hartwell told Isabella, after she had described the ghostly children and the music box's impossible properties. "Sometimes objects can become vessels for spiritual energies that refuse to depart this earthly realm when death calls them home. If the Grimwald children perished in confusion and distress, their souls might have attached themselves to something that provided comfort during their final suffering." The Reverend's explanation offered little consolation, but his willingness to bless the music box and pray for the peaceful rest of the trapped spirits gave Isabella hope that divine intervention might succeed where physical destruction had failed. Hartwell arrived at the Ashford home the following evening, carrying his worn leather Bible and a bottle of blessed water, prepared to conduct whatever form of spiritual cleansing his faith provided for such extraordinary circumstances. But when Reverend Hartwell approached the music box to begin his prayers and blessings, the instrument's behavior became far more aggressive than Isabella had previously witnessed. The haunting melody grew discordantly loud, and the wooden case began to vibrate with such violent intensity that it moved across the table surface under its own supernatural power. The glass top developed a spiderweb pattern of cracks, though it did not completely shatter, and a cold wind began to blow through the kitchen despite all windows and doors being securely fastened. More alarming still, the 5 ghostly children materialized inside the house rather than remaining outdoors as they had during their previous manifestations. They appeared suddenly around the kitchen table, their spectral forms more solid and detailed than Isabella had ever seen them, and their expressions had transformed from pleading to righteous anger at the Reverend's attempt to banish them from the mortal world. Adelaide stepped forward to position herself between Reverend Hartwell and the music box, her translucent form seeming to glow with internal light that cast no shadows on the walls around her. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear authority of a child accustomed to having her wishes respected, but with an undertone of desperation that made her words all the more chilling to hear. "You cannot send us away," she declared, her luminous eyes fixed on the Reverend's face with unnerving intensity. "We have waited far too long and endured far too much suffering to be denied now. The music calls to us, and it calls to her, and she will come with us willingly when she fully understands the eternal joy that awaits beyond the boundary of your temporary world." Reverend Hartwell attempted to respond with biblical quotations and prayers for the peaceful rest of departed souls, but his holy words seemed to have no effect whatsoever on the ghostly children. If anything, his spiritual intervention appeared to strengthen their manifestation, allowing them to interact more directly with the physical world than they had previously been able to accomplish. Little Oliver moved toward Clara with his small arms extended in innocent invitation, his gap-toothed smile radiating the genuine friendship that had characterized him in life. "Please come and play with us," he said in a voice like silver bells stirred by gentle breezes. "We know such wonderful games to show you, and you'll never be lonely or frightened or sad again once you join our special circle." Clara took a step toward the spectral child before her mother could intervene, and in that terrifying moment, Isabella understood that the music box and the ghostly children represented a temptation that would ultimately prove irresistible to a 5-year-old's imagination and longing for perfect friendship. The spirits offered everything that childhood craved most desperately: eternal playmates, endless games, and freedom from the fears and disappointments that inevitably accompanied growing up in a world where beloved people died and cherished dreams were broken. Reverend Hartwell made one final attempt to assert divine authority over the supernatural situation, raising his Bible high and calling upon heavenly power to release the trapped souls and protect the innocent living from their otherworldly influence. But his prayers were completely drowned out by the music box's melody, which had grown so overwhelmingly loud that it seemed to originate from the walls and floorboards themselves rather than from the small wooden instruments sitting on the kitchen table. The 5 ghostly children joined their ethereal voices to the mechanical tune, creating a harmony that was simultaneously heartbreakingly beautiful and utterly terrifying in its power to compel and seduce. Clara began to move toward them with dreamy, measured steps, her young face reflecting the same peaceful longing that Isabella recognized in her own expression whenever the haunting music played. But as Clara reached out to take Oliver's translucent hand, the kitchen door burst open, and Jeremiah Ashford stumbled inside, his clothes torn and muddied, his face bearing the wild expression of a man who had traveled impossible distances in desperate haste. He had been away for nearly a week, delivering grain to markets in distant towns, and should not have been able to return for at least another 3 days. "I heard the singing in my dreams," Jeremiah gasped, his eyes taking in the scene of ghostly children and supernatural manifestation, without apparent surprise or disbelief. "I heard it calling to our Clara, pulling at her innocent spirit, and I knew something terrible was threatening our family. I've been riding day and night without rest, following the sound that grew stronger and more urgent the closer I came to home." Jeremiah's sudden arrival disrupted whatever mystical spell the ghostly children had been weaving around Clara's consciousness, and the little girl hesitated in her approach toward the spectral Oliver. The 5 spirits turned their attention toward this new presence, their expressions showing concern that their carefully orchestrated recruitment might be interrupted by parental interference and protective love. "You cannot prevent what has already been set in motion," Adelaide said, her voice carrying the regal authority of a child who had never been refused anything she truly wanted. "The music has chosen her, just as it chose us so many years ago, and she will come with us willingly when she fully comprehends the eternal paradise that awaits beyond the veil of mortal existence and suffering." But Jeremiah Ashford had not ridden through 2 days and nights of desperate travel to arrive too late to save his beloved daughter. He strode across the kitchen to the table where the music box sat surrounded by its supernatural guardians, and before anyone could react to stop him, he brought his work-hardened fist down upon the cracked glass top with all the force that paternal love and righteous fury could provide. The glass shattered completely, sending razor-sharp fragments flying across the kitchen and silencing the haunting melody with the finality of a death scream. The sudden quiet that followed felt like the aftermath of thunder, heavy and profound and ringing with echoes of the supernatural harmony that had filled the room just moments before. And sometimes, when Clara played alone in the yard during quiet summer afternoons, Isabella would notice her daughter pausing in her solitary games to listen intently to sounds that no adult ears could detect, her young face reflecting the same wistful longing that had characterized her during the ghostly children's supernatural visitation. The music box fragments were indeed completely burned in the fireplace, and the resulting ashes were scattered in Thornfield Creek, where the running water would carry them far from human habitation. But melodies have a way of persisting beyond the destruction of the instruments that produce them, and songs that have been heard by Maori